Hello everyone. Today I have a chilling story sent in by one of our subscribers, Rachel from New Orleans. She reached out to me with a tale that shook her to her core, a story about her husband and the dark past he tried to leave behind. But some things, as Rachel learned, can never be buried. This is her account of the horrors that ensued after her husband's release from prison, a man with a history so disturbing that it led them both down a path of terror. Let's dive into the story that Rachel has titled, The Grave Robber's Curse. Rachel met her husband Ethan in what she thought was the most unlikely of places, a support group for ex-convicts trying to reintegrate into society. Ethan was different from the others. He was quiet, almost withdrawn, and there was a weight in his eyes that Rachel couldn't quite place. It was only after several meetings that he finally opened up to her, revealing the dark secret of his past. Ethan had once been a grave robber. It wasn't something he was proud of, but desperation had driven him to it. He'd grown up in a rough part of town, and with no family to support him, he fell in with a bad crowd. They introduced him to grave robbing as a way to make quick money, selling stolen valuables from the dead to shady collectors. He quickly became skilled at the trade, learning how to avoid the authorities, pick the right graves, and cover his tracks. But as time went on, Ethan's actions began to take a toll on his psyche. The dead, he believed, were starting to haunt him. He began having vivid nightmares, terrifying visions of the graves he had desecrated and the corpses he had disturbed. Ethan tried to ignore the nightmares, chalking them up to guilt and paranoia. But they only grew worse, following him into his waking hours. He started seeing shadows that weren't there, hearing whispers when he was alone, and feeling an oppressive presence that made his skin crawl. One night, it all came to a head. Ethan and his crew had targeted a particularly old cemetery on the outskirts of town. Rumor had it that the graves there belonged to wealthy families, their deceased members buried with priceless heirlooms. They arrived at midnight, shovels in hand, and began digging up the graves. But as soon as Ethan struck the coffin of their first target, something went terribly wrong. A foul stench filled the air, and an unnatural coldness seeped into the ground beneath their feet. The coffin lid was splintered, revealing the decayed remains of what had once been a woman, now little more than bones and scraps of fabric. But there was something else in the coffin. Something that shouldn't have been there. A small, ornate box, carved with strange symbols, sat beside the corpse. Ethan reached for it, but the moment his fingers touched the box, a searing pain shot up his arm. He recoiled in shock, and his crewmates rushed to help him. But as they did, the ground beneath them began to shake. The earth seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the air was filled with an eerie, high-pitched wail. Panicked, the crew fled, abandoning the box and leaving the grave half open. Ethan was the last to leave, and as he turned to run, he swore he saw the corpse's eyes open, two hollow black pits staring directly at him. That night marked the beginning of Ethan's downfall. The authorities, alerted by nearby residents who had heard the commotion, arrested Ethan and his crew. They were convicted of grave robbery and sentenced to several years in prison. But for Ethan, the real punishment was yet to come. After serving his sentence, Ethan was released from prison. He vowed to leave his past behind and start anew. That was when he met Rachel. She knew about his past but believed that everyone deserved a second chance. They fell in love and got married, moving into a modest home on the outskirts of New Orleans. For a while, things seemed normal. Ethan found work as a handyman, and they lived a quiet life. But the peace was short-lived. The nightmares that had plagued Ethan years before began to return, stronger, more vivid, and far more terrifying. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, screaming about shadows and voices. Rachel would try to comfort him, but the fear in his eyes was something she could never fully erase. He told her about the grave he had desecrated, about the cursed box he had found, and about the feeling that something was following him, something that had been awoken that night in the cemetery. Rachel, though frightened, tried to remain supportive. She convinced Ethan to seek help, and he began seeing a therapist. But the therapy sessions did little to quell the growing sense of dread that hung over their lives. Ethan began to change. He became withdrawn, his once warm and loving demeanor replaced by a cold, distant shell of his former self. He started avoiding certain places in the house, claiming they were tainted. He would spend hours in the basement, refusing to let Rachel join him, muttering to himself as he worked on something she couldn't see. The turning point came one night when Rachel awoke to find Ethan standing at the foot of their bed, staring down at her with a vacant expression. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his hands were clenched into fists. When she called his name, he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her in a state of panic. She followed him down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the living room, she found Ethan standing in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames. The room was filled with an oppressive, suffocating atmosphere, and the shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe like living things. "Ethan," she whispered, afraid to raise her voice. "What's wrong?" He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. "They're here," he said, his voice hollow and distant. "They've found me." Before she could ask who they were, the room was plunged into darkness. The fire in the fireplace went out, and the temperature dropped sharply. Rachel could feel the presence of several somethings, in the room with them. She could hear faint whispers, like the rustling of dry leaves, and the sound of footsteps that weren't their own. Suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening noise, a combination of wailing, screaming, and a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around them. The shadows on the walls began to move, stretching out towards them with claw-like tendrils. Rachel screamed and grabbed Ethan's arm, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the darkness as if transfixed. The shadows reached out and wrapped around him, pulling him towards the center of the room. Rachel tried to hold on to him, but the force was too strong. She was thrown back against the wall, and the last thing she saw before losing consciousness was Ethan being consumed by the darkness. Rachel woke up on the floor of the living room, disoriented and alone. The room was silent, the oppressive atmosphere gone, but the terror lingered. She called out for Ethan, but there was no answer. She searched the house frantically, but he was nowhere to be found. In the days that followed, Rachel was haunted by the events of that night. Strange things began happening around the house. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and she would hear footsteps in the hallways when she was alone. But the most disturbing were the whispers. They were faint, barely audible, but always there, just on the edge of her hearing. They seemed to come from the walls, the floors, the very air around her, and they were always saying the same thing: "He belongs to us." Rachel's once warm and inviting home had become a prison, and she felt like she was being watched at all times. She could no longer sleep in her bed, afraid that she would wake up to find Ethan standing over her again. She started sleeping on the couch, but even there, she was plagued by nightmares. One night, she dreamt that she was back in the old cemetery, standing over the grave that Ethan had desecrated. The coffin was open, and the same foul stench filled the air. The corpse inside was no longer just bones and scraps of fabric. It was fully formed, its eyes wide open and staring at her. But this time, the corpse spoke. "Why did you take it?" the corpse whispered, its voice raspy and filled with malice. "Why did you disturb my rest?" Rachel woke up screaming, her heart pounding in her chest. She was drenched in sweat, her hands shaking uncontrollably. But the terror of the dream didn't end when she woke up. The whispers followed her into the waking world, growing louder and more insistent. She knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed a bag and fled, leaving behind everything she owned. But even as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. She could see shadows in the rearview mirror, twisting and writhing like they had in the living room. And the whispers continued to haunt her. Desperate for answers, Rachel returned to the old cemetery where Ethan's life had taken its dark turn. She had no idea what she was looking for, but she knew she had to find something, anything, that could help her understand what was happening. The cemetery was just as she had imagined it, old, overgrown, and filled with crumbling tombstones. The night was dark, and the only light came from the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Rachel found the grave easily enough. It was exactly as Ethan had described, an old, weathered tombstone, partially obscured by weeds. The grave itself looked undisturbed, but Rachel knew better. She could feel the same oppressive atmosphere that had filled the living room, and the whispers were louder than ever. "He belongs to us," they hissed. "You cannot escape." Rachel knelt by the grave, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the earth. She didn't know what she was expecting, some sign, some clue, but all she felt was cold, damp dirt. But as she dug her fingers into the ground, she felt something hard, a small, smooth object buried just beneath the surface. She pulled it out and held it up to the moonlight. It was the box Ethan had described, the same one he had found in the coffin. The symbols carved into it were still there, glowing faintly in the darkness. As she stared at the box, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Return it," they demanded. "Return what was taken." Rachel didn't know what to do. She could feel the presence of something around her, something malevolent and hungry. The shadows seemed to close in on her, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. In a panic, Rachel threw the box back into the grave and began to cover it with dirt. But as she did, the ground beneath her began to shake, just as it had that night in the cemetery. The earth pulsed, and the tombstone began to crack, splitting down the middle. The box sank into the ground, and for a moment everything was still. But then, the ground erupted, and from the grave rose a figure, pale, gaunt, and rotting. It was the corpse from her nightmares, its eyes hollow and filled with hatred. "You cannot escape," it rasped. "You will join him." Rachel screamed and tried to run, but the shadows closed in, trapping her in place. The corpse reached out with skeletal hands, its fingers like claws, and Rachel felt a cold, clammy grip around her throat. She struggled, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong, and the whispers were deafening. As the world around her faded to black, the last thing Rachel heard was the voice of the corpse, whispering in her ear, "He belongs to us, and now, so do you." When Rachel was found the next morning, she was lying unconscious by the grave, her hands and clothes covered in dirt. The police were called, and she was taken to the hospital, but she was never the same again. She refused to speak of what had happened that night, and she never returned to the house she had once shared with Ethan. The whispers, she claimed, followed her everywhere, no matter where she went. She could still feel the presence of the shadows, always watching, always waiting. Ethan was never found. His disappearance remains a mystery, but Rachel knows the truth. He had become a part of the darkness, just like the spirits of the graves he had robbed. And now, she was bound to that darkness as well, a prisoner of a curse that could never be broken. Rachel's story is a chilling reminder of the dangers that can come from disturbing the dead. Some things are best left buried, and some pasts can never be escaped. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of terror. And if you have a story of your own, don't hesitate to reach out. Who knows? Your experience might be the next one to send chills down the spines of our viewers. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the past is better left undisturbed.